Okay, so for part 3, we're going to talk about the descent and the squat. The number one thing you need to focus on in the descent is staying balanced. The squat is essentially just a balance exercise with weight on your back. So an easy way to find your center of gravity, which you're trying to stick to throughout the entire range of motion, is you do this simple exercise where you take roughly your squat stance, don't put the bar on your back, and I want you to lean forward until your heels just come up off the ground. This puts your center of gravity right over your toes, and then shift back until your toes come up. This puts your center of gravity back in your heels, and you're trying to find the midpoint between those two extremes, and that's where roughly you're going to stay for the entirety of the range of motion, all the way down and all the way up. Another thing that's going to help stay balanced in the squat is making sure your torso has a little bit of an incline to it. You don't want to be standing completely straight, because when you have a bar on your back, the bar is actually what's going to sit over your center of gravity, not your head. So what do I mean by that? I'll take a high bar grip and I'll put that bar on my back, and you'll be able to see from the side roughly where my torso ends up so that I can stay balanced over my midfoot. So squeeze the shoulder blades together, put the bar on my upper traps, brace in my abs, big breath, unrack, step back 2 to 3 times. Okay, so in this position here, you can see my toes don't really have a whole lot of pressure on them, my heels don't really have a whole lot of pressure on them. I'm right in the center of my foot, and the bar is centered over my center of gravity. But you'll notice that my torso has a little bit of a lean to it. You don't want to lean too far forward, because again, that puts your center of gravity too far forward. You don't want to lean too far back. Just a slight incline, and this is completely normal when you're squatting. Now we're going to get into actually initiating the squat. So when you're squatting with the bar on your back, or any other squat for that matter, you don't want to let your knees go forward first, and you don't want to let your hips shoot back first. You want to kind of simultaneously unlock both your knees and your hips at the same time. So I'll show you an example. Alright, so first thing, find my center of gravity. Find that pressure in my foot, that's the midpoint. In this position here, I'm going to keep that torso inclined and not lean too far forward. I'm going to unlock my hips and my knees at the same time, making sure I stay balanced in that same place over my foot, and then stand back up. One thing that you want to watch out for is your squat depth, like how deep you're going in the squat. When you're first getting started, you just want to go as low as comfortably possible, and for some people, you may not be able to get super far down in the squat. That's totally fine, but your goal should be to at least try and get as low as you can to parallel. And by parallel, I mean with your hips coming about level with the top of your knee. One thing that can limit depth is your torso angle. So we talk about maintaining a slight incline with the bar on your back. One thing that can set people back and make them squat a little bit higher than what they can actually do is trying to stay super upright. If you really arch your back and you try and squat, you'll hit a point where you can't go any lower if you keep your lower back in this position. This is because when you're at about parallel and below, your lower back is supposed to round out a little bit. If you limit that last little bit of range of motion, your hips aren't really going to go anywhere. Another thing that can limit your squat depth is your ankle range of motion. This isn't as common as you might read online, but it is something to consider. When you're squatting and you're letting your knees drift forward over your toes, you're going to need some level of ankle mobility to be able to get your knees at least over the top of your feet. If your knees go past your feet, that's not necessarily a problem, but if you have such little ankle range of motion that you can't even get to this point, you might need to start working on just some basic calf mobility exercises that we can show you in a later video. If you do find that you have less ankle mobility than is required to get down in a really deep squat position, one simple fix without actually dedicating a whole lot of time to ankle mobility drills is just simply elevating your heels. You can do this by wearing squat shoes if you want to buy a pair of those, or really simple fix, if you're in a commercial gym, you have access to a couple of extra 10-pound plates or just some elevated surfaces, you can put those underneath your heels for your squat sets. Another common thing that can happen in the squat is what's called a butt wink. So a butt wink is essentially just a term for when somebody is squatting and close to the bottom of the end of the range of motion, their hips tuck underneath and they round their lower back to a very high degree. Now, if you have a little bit of rounding in your lower back, that's not a problem, and it's kind of to be expected with the deeper you go in a squat, because your back has to round a bit to allow that range of motion to occur. So we know that butt wink isn't really a problem if it's very slight. If it's really egregious though, and you notice a lot of rounding in your lower back if you take a video from the side, it's not that it's necessarily a dangerous position to get into, it's just really inefficient, and you'll probably notice that if you correct it at least a bit, you'll get a little bit more out of your squats. Okay, so for butt wink, one thing that you don't need to focus on in trying to correct it is stretching your hamstrings. There's a lot of information online that'll tell you that tight hamstrings are one of the main contributors to butt wink. This is not the case. When you're squatting, the hamstrings actually do very little. It's because of the mechanics of the squat. Your hamstrings don't change position a whole lot. One thing that you can focus on, however, is your stance width and the elevation of your heels. Usually people with a lot of butt wink, it's not that anything's particularly tight. It could be a few different factors. One main thing is your hip anthropometry, just how you're made up. So modifying your stance width, the bar position, your torso incline, all these things that you can modify will usually help rectify that. It'll just take a little bit of playing around to figure that out. One of the last things to focus on is just repeated exposures. A lot of people who have form that doesn't really feel too familiar to them, or it's uncomfortable when they're squatting, especially when they're new to squatting, it's usually it's a new movement. You just gotta give yourself time to adapt to it and get used to it, and then if you find that things are still a little bit wonky, you can start to experiment with it. You don't wanna throw the kitchen sink at something when you first start it, because it's hard to stay consistent and find what actually works for you.